Okay.
Great, good. Then we can get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this session of the colloquium, and a special thanks and welcome to Camila Vergara, our guest today. Camila is a critical legal and political theorist and a senior lecturer at the University of Essex in the UK. She's also the editor of Theoria, a journal of social and political theory, and has recently worked in a whole variety of fields, constitutional theory, republicanism. She's written on corruption, on populism. Her book, Systemic Corruption, Constitutional Ideas for an Anti-Oligarchic Republic, that came out with Princeton University Press a couple of years ago, has been widely discussed, and she has also commented on current affairs in non-academic outlets such as the New Left Review and Jacobin. Now, the talk that Camila is going to give today and that we're going to discuss under the title Corrupt Republics, Oligarchy, War, and the Destruction of Nature was initially supposed to be the annual Eugen Kogon Lecture at the Department of Political Science at the Technical University in Darmstadt, which Camila was invited to deliver last November. Now, just a few weeks before the lecture, the department, or rather the professors, as they called themselves, decided to unilaterally cancel the talk due to Camila's criticism of Israel as an apartheid state and of the ongoing genocide in Palestine, especially based on things that Camila had posted on social media. Now, this was not only an act of censorship and a grave violation of academic freedom that unfortunately can no longer be regarded as exceptional in the German context. You'll all remember the disinvitation of Nancy Fraser from the University of Cologne also last year. But it was also a public attack on Camila as a scholar and as a public intellectual. She was falsely accused of anti-Semitism, of promoting conspiracy theories and other things, allegations that the department had first published on its website and then has taken offline again, as far as I know, at least, without further comment or without an apology. Now, that's an example, I think, of the kind of politically and intellectually irresponsible behavior and of the kind of repression that has become increasingly normalized in the German context over the last years. And so I was all the happier that Camila accepted the invitation to present the talk in this context at the Colloquium for Social Philosophy at FU Berlin. Initially, the idea was to have her in Berlin in person, but given the short time frame and logistical complications, that wasn't really feasible. So I'm very glad that we managed to organize it in this form as a Zoom event, which also allows people who are not based in Berlin to participate. And well, yeah, some of them are here in the Zoom today. In the face of all these authoritarian and repressive developments that we've been witnessing over the last years, but really increasingly over the last couple of months, it's, I think, obvious that we really need to keep open and defend the spaces of critical discussion and inquiry that still exist. And in this spirit, I'm really very happy to be able to welcome Camila again and to hand it over to her. And yeah, we're looking forward to the talk and to the discussion with you. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin, for the invitation, for making a space for the lecture at your institution. So the lecture that I prepared and I will give today makes the relation between Republican theory, war, and oligarchy, and basically spans from the ancient Roman Republic to today. So it's kind of a long span of theory and practice, if you will. So I prepared some slides. So yeah. So to begin with, I wanted to talk about the Roman Republic as a system that is much more similar to our understanding of democracies today, in a way, than the democratic Athens, in which self-rule was the norm. In the late Roman Republic, there were three sources of authority: the few, the one, and the many. And these sources of authority were rooted in specific groups in society. So the few had their own institutions, like the Senate, and also were the ones selected to higher office. And basically, the Senate controlled the whole system by controlling finance. And this was understood as an indirect form of control, as a counsel or suggestions that were always taken up, because if consuls or magistrates decided to run with their own agenda and not obey the Senate, then the Senate next time around would not fund their enterprises. So it was a tight kind of control based on the budget. Okay, and the only a source of authority that was independent from this system was the plebeian council and the tribunes, which were basically the expression of a plebeian power, the power of the non-nobles who assembled and always got concessions from the elite through force. Okay, the first they got their tribunes, their exclusive representatives, after seceding in time of war and decided not to fight for Rome, and basically the elites had to go to the plebeian quarter to ask for the soldiers to take up the arms again. And the only way that they did that was if the tribunes, who were their representatives, their delegates more than the representatives, were acknowledged and given real power. So if we see the Polybius's understanding of the system, and Polybius was a Greek a historian that was captured and kept in Rome, and he explained basically how the system worked and what would be the best form of republic and what would be its corrupt form. So basically, in the classical deviation and corruption of regimes, in which monarchy becomes tyranny, aristocracy becomes oligarchy, and democracy becomes ochlocracy, the best regime is the combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And we need to remember that this is very different from Aristotle, for whom democracy, the politeia, which was the regime that he deemed as the best regime, was actually a combination of the two worst forms of government, oligarchy and democracy. So a Rome mixed constitution, we pass from an oligarchic republic to a form of empire. And here, if we see the combination of this different strata and the different institutions, we see that even if the institutions were there at the end of the Roman Republic, at the end of the 1st century BC, we had a diminishing authority of the plebeian council and the tribunes, and an enlarged authority of the Senate, especially of the magistrates. So basically, empire is born out of this kind of unbalance of power within the Roman Republic. So in republicanism, as kind of a tradition, long tradition, I have traced two sources of authority. And two traditions that are mapped out from these sources of authority. One strand that is elitist and the other that is plebeian. So it depends on who has the final authority in the system. So even if in the late Roman Republic, the plebeian council had formally the last word in the system, because of the indirect control of the Senate and the intermingling of the elites, of the plebeian elite with the nobles, then the plebeian authority was undermined, and even if the institutions were strong and proliferated, the plebeian institutions, in paper, in fact, was the Senate which had ultimate power. So in the elitist strand, the Senate is which controls the system and controls through finances, and it does through this indirect rule. And for elitists like Cicero, for example, the final authority even if formally it was based on the people of Rome. At the end, the final authority was divine. It was the nobles will consult the auguries, basically, they had divination, and the priests were all from elitist origin, and therefore there was a control of the divine from the elites. So there was always a possibility of shutting down any kind of more progressive form of politics coming from below. In the plebeian strand, and from this elitist strand, we have like the most dominant form of republicanism, which is commenced by Cicero and is followed up by Montesquieu, and then by the American founders such as James Madison. So this elitist strand of republicanism, in which basically the people had formal power, but do not have de facto power. They do not have real power. This was what basically became hegemonic as the Republican ideology. So today, when we talk about republicanism in general, we're talking about elitist republicanism, in which the balance of power and the structures of the republic are basically forwarding or enabling the elite power and not really the popular power. Then in the plebeian strand, which I have developed in my work, we have the plebeian assembly, which was an assembly based on politics of presence. So all the plebeians could attend, and whoever was able to enter the assembly or the forum as well were counted in. The plebeian class was fluid. Anyone coming into the Roman Republic, either by colonization or annexation, was immediately put into the plebeian ranks. And therefore, in a way, it was in favor of the plebeian power to branch out and allow for these colonial experiences, because you would bring more plebeian classes within, and the power is always in numbers. So this plebeian assembly and the tribunate had ultimate lawmaking power through what were called the plebiscites. So here we can make a link with direct democracy and citizen initiative. So all of the law, and the law was a monopoly of plebeians at the moment, emerged from the plebeian assembly. It was discussed, it was proposed by a tribune, and then discussed and approved by the assembly, and that became law. So the Senate didn't have the power of law, and neither had any other of the nobles. It was always the plebeian class, which is remarkable, since today we have a Congress, which is or the Parliament, which is an institution in which its members are selected by a popular vote. However, they are from an elite background, the majority, and they, more importantly, they govern and they pass laws in favor of the elites. And in this plebeian strand, the final authority is the people. And here, from this, I have traced this strand from Lucretius in the ancient Roman Republic to Machiavelli in the Florentine Republic of the 15th and the 15th, 16th century. And Condorcet, the Marquis of Condorcet during the French Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, and others who have been pushing for the plebeian class or the plebeian strata to have final decision-making power in a republic. So first, I'm going to start with corruption. What do we mean by corruption, especially in the Republican tradition? So here I'm basing this understanding on Machiavelli, and there's others, but just for brevity. For Machiavelli, there are three layers in the Republican tradition of corruption: matter, form, and methods. So the matter is the individual citizens, and of course, he famously says that citizens and humans in general are fickle and wicked, always prone to take advantage of the possibilities for themselves. So there's always a desire to dominate and possess that is constrained by laws. So for him, putting the weight of the guilt on corruption on the matter is just useless, because individuals just are molded by the laws and institutions. However, for him, the form, these laws and institutions, are not enough to keep this ambition in check. he talks about two different forms of corruption or corrupting tendencies. One is moral license, in a way the not having any rules or regulations for morality, and the other is economic inequality and the enabling of luxury, something that is inherently corrupting of the free republic. However, for Machiavelli, the form is not enough, because the form, as we see, laws, they need to be enforced, and therefore laws can be in the books but not really enforced. And at the end, what is the main source of corruption for him are the methods, the procedures by which power is allocated. So he says that in the Roman Republic, there were two methods that allowed for corruption to proliferate. The one, and this is remarkable because we have made elections the definition of our democracy, the core of our democracy. But for Machiavelli, elections, the idea of self-selection and putting yourself as a candidate was a source of corruption, because even if everyone could put their name forward for becoming elected, at the end, only the people with money and resources and free time, in a way, the nobles, would put their name forward for elections, and they would be selected. Okay, so in a way, it didn't, free election did not allow for the diversity of leadership. Okay, and the other procedure and method, he calls it, that brings corruption to the Republic is none other than free speech. And he says that at the beginning of the Republic, this was great, because basically anyone could put forward a law or a form of regulation that would allow for the Republic to be better, to be not corrupt. However, with the passing of time, only those who were strong enough and who were powerful were speaking. And that meant that that kind of control of the narrative in the Roman Republic is what is equivalent to what Gramsci would say is hegemony. The narrative that is undergirds basically the power of the elite, that is not really exercising it directly, but through the narrative and the speech that undergirds the laws and regulations. So if we think about inequality and corruption in general, inequality is the main source of corruption, in the sense that with free speech and with elections, the problem is that some people have more resources, are more educated, or whatever other resource they have. This creates a gap among the citizens. So to more inequality, there's more corruption. And here I have coined this term, systemic corruption, which I define as the oligarchization of society's political structure and legal structure. And this systemic corruption allows for the constant and systemic violation of human rights. So inequality, and Machiavelli is very clear about this, a republic can only tolerate a low form of inequality. More inequality is conducive to empire and to monarchy, and not to republic. So if we want to have a republic, we need to cut down on the inequality, not only in terms of wealth, but in other kinds of resources that the elites are can put their hands on, basically. So if we think about the world today, we know that the inequality, global inequality, is really outrageous. The richest 10% today owns 77% of the global wealth, and the bottom percent owns only 1.7%. And of course, if we go and we break it down in terms of regions of the world, we go, for example, to Latin America, in which the bottom 50% not only doesn't own any wealth, but actually is in debt. So it's minus, it is below 0% in a way. It is kind of really in debt to the rich oligarchs. And of course, the middle class, if we think about the regions, just shrinks, because here Europe is the region that is bringing the middle class in a larger proportion, even in Sweden and other places they're supposedly more equal. The gap has been growing exponentially in the last decade. So according to Transparency International, and here I quote from 2016, because what has been happening is that Transparency International and other institutions have been changing the way that we measure corruption, because the problem was that the world was so corrupt that there was almost defeated the purpose of actually measuring it, because everybody is corrupt. And we see here from the map that all of the countries in red are basically systemically corrupt, with what calls Transparency International endemic corruption, which basically allows for the violation of human rights and fuels social exclusion. And of course, we know that the United States, which is in a lighter shade, is extremely corrupt. So this doesn't even account for the amount of corruption. And just a side note, how this is measured, corruption is based on perception, because basically the legal structure of countries is very different. What is corruption in one country is legal in others. How is it measured is the elites of the countries basically reports back on their perception of corruption. So already it's a very distorted kind of index. Okay. So here I put forward this kind of tripartite understanding of corruption, in which we have individual corruption, in which this is the one that we are familiar with, and is the hegemonic understanding of corruption after the 18th century, in which individualism became the core of law. And basically corruption is the illegal actions of public officials. And basically people that are corrupt are put in prison in a way. So it's individualized. And we can think about the metaphor of the bad apples. There's other, now more recent, in the last 20 years, there have been a development on what is called institutional corruption with Dennis Thompson and others, who basically says that institutional corruption means that the institutions that exist in society are corrupt when their public purposes are distorted by private interest. So we can think about, for example, the healthcare system in the United States, in which is based on private health insurance, and it is serving really the pockets of the insurers more than the health of the people. So there we can talk about a form of institutional corruption in which the systems work for the private benefit instead of the public benefit. And then is the one that I put forward, which is the systemic corruption. And basically it talks about the rule of law. We think about the rule of law, and we talk about republicanism and the rule of law as equivalent to liberty. The idea that there is rule of law, immediately we understand it as the country is free, right? That the individuals have a recourse in the courts, and therefore the rule of law functions for preserving and forwarding the liberty of individuals. However, when we have systemic corruption, it means that the rule of law disproportionately benefits the powerful few, right? And really promotes inequality and the oligarchization of power instead of cutting down on inequality and oligarchization of power. So in a way, it is the monopoly of the power by the few, and the trickling up of wealth from the bottom to the top. And this is what I call systemic corruption, which we can think about the rotten tree in a way, when a tree consistently gives bad apples and consistently have decaying branches. We really need to think about something at the roots, right? And this is the idea of the structural part of corruption, which basically is connected with structural domination and the systemic violation of human rights. So here to kind of summarize, systemic corruption is a slow-moving process of the oligarchization of society, and therefore is very difficult to measure. It's a very long span and start little by little, and then it accelerates, and then we can see it. And of course, we have that law, procedures, and institutions are really there to benefit and empower and represent the rich and powerful instead of the people. The people are there only to authorize the few to rule us in a way. And this is what I have called oligarchic democracy. And we need to define our forms of government as oligarchic democracies instead of just liberal democracies, because basically it is a regime in which the people empower through their votes an elite who rule and rule for their own sake. So in liberal democracy, if we think about the corruption of liberal democracy, we think about this regime as having two components. One is the majority vote that elects the representatives and has a majority will that is we cannot really ascertain which is that will. It is elected representatives act as ventriloquists of the majority, and therefore we have this elected government by the few. And this is all kind of constrained by the majority will, and the elected representatives are constrained by constitutions with individual rights and separation of powers. However, when this liberal democracy starts to decay, the constraints of power starts diminishing and starts becoming way more porous. So and there's a confusion, and we can talk about this. My other work is on populism, how we have confused populism with fascism today. And for me, the populist democracy is the one in which the majority interest and the majority will basically become enlarged, and the few have become constrained. And this is not what we have, and this basically doesn't exist almost anywhere. But what we have is the oligarchic democracy, in which the people and the majority will has been really diminished and become really formal, and the interests of the few have become enlarged and really rule almost by themselves. So if we think about the allocation of wealth in society and what effect does this have in the regime type, we have that social democracy as it was conceived after World War II, especially in Europe, in which you have socioeconomic rights that were fulfilled, and basically that the bottom 90% of the population owns at least 50% of the wealth. This is remarkable and never happened again, not even today. There's no country in the world in which the 50%, the bottom 50% owns 90% of the wealth. This social democracy has been corrupted into liberal democracy, or a democracy in which there are only formal rights. And this liberal democracy, as I said before, can corrupt in two different ways. One, through a populist democracy, in which you can decay further into a totalitarian form of democracy. We can think about regimes in which the majority actually rules, and there is almost no individual rights, but still they are served in terms of their welfare. And what we have today, which is oligarchic democracy, which very fast corrupts into illiberal oligarchy. So an oligarchy, the same regime that we have today, in which those formal rights are not really respected anymore. So oligarchic democracy is defined as a regime in which the few are elected by popular vote, and they basically legislate and operate at the detriment of the common people. And one of the features of this oligarchic democracy is that it's extractivist, and it weaponizes the state to extract, either by exploiting the people, increasing their taxes, and enabling the plunder of nature for profit. So in a way, this idea that conservative thought is against the state is really nonsensical, in the sense that all of the elites are trying to weaponize the state for their own gain. And I will talk a little bit more after at the end of the talk about this. So I want to here bring Condorcet, which is what he says is very interesting, because he, from the very beginning of the French Revolution, he criticizes the United States and the Constitution of the United States based on this doctrine of separation of powers, which is created or established or thought about by Montesquieu, but really established legally by Madison. And basically what Condorcet says is that with this separation of powers, the simplicity of the constitutions are disfigured, and this only serves to conceal corruption. So, and he asks, what happens when all of the powers of government, so the parliamentary, the judiciary, and the executive, really band together against the people? And this is actually what is happening today. And there's this meme about of Donald Trump basically hiding hiding behind the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court and the judicial system is not there to save us or protect the citizens from the outreach and the overgrowth of executive power in this manner, but actually serve to protect it and to really forward and deepen systemic corruption. So he talks about that the regime that comes out of the US is really a form of indirect despotism. And he says that basically, even if the laws are followed and there is procedurally sound representative government, there's no really a violation straight up, but there is a legalization of corruption and a legalization of this outgrowth of executive power is really a de facto oligarchy. And this is really what we have today, in which the rule of law is respected in a way, but that rule of law really doesn't serve the many, but serves the few. And the judicial system is there to basically rubber stamp what is happening with the executive power. So now I want to talk a little bit about wars and the relation between wars and republics. So here I want to center on Machiavelli's insights on this topic. So when Machiavelli was a secretary in the Florentine Republic, he was a diplomat. He had to basically deal with the imminent war with Pisa at that time. And the problem was that even if Florence had been emancipated from the power of the Medici, of this the bankers basically of that time, and had embraced a form of popular self-rule through the Great Council, which was at least a third from plebeian origin and had like the power to authorize and to affirm anything that happens in the republic, and this was understood as a popular republic. The reality was that this popular republic was dependent on the emergency loans coming from oligarchy every time that Florence had to go to war. So they didn't have a standing army, and therefore they need to hire mercenaries for going to war. So Machiavelli argues that the solution for this getting rid of oligarchy and the stronghold and the grip of oligarchy on the popular republic was to decouple the military from the oligarchy by creating a citizen army. And so the push for the citizen army, which is crucial in the Republican theory, is based on this idea that even if you can have popular government, if you don't have a standing army and the citizens defending themselves, at the end, the republic could go to war for profit or will end up in debt when it goes to war, and therefore dependent on the oligarchy. And the oligarchy, again, the same as in the Roman Republic, would have an indirect form of control over the republican structure. So for him, the republican liberty is not only popular self-rule, but also financial autonomy. And here we can see the kind of the elements at work with the financial military complex that is basically born in that moment, and it has been developed and really become to an epic height today. So we have that war drove the republic into debt, and that debt allowed for the oligarchy to become even more wealthy and engage in more luxury, and this allowed for more inequality in the republic, which fueled systemic corruption and the connection with war by forcing the republic to go to war with the influence of the oligarchy that had become powerful through debt. So if we think about today, we have the mercenary armies, and they're still used, by the way, in which indirect despotism is allowed through this public debt. And we have, on the other hand, a standing army that has allowed for oligarchic imperialism. And really, there's no much difference between these two today. If we think about the Israeli army, in which you can think about as a citizen army because there is a mandatory military conscription, and basically the citizens are defending the republic, really the level of indoctrination coming from the state allows for the citizens and the citizen army to become the mercenaries of the oligarchic state, Okay, so in a way, even if we have a standing army, the way that we pay for it as a kind of and the way it is structured as a regular job, if you will, and following orders instead of having real citizens making the last call in terms of if they're going to war or not, allows for the standing army to become a kind of mercenary army today. The United States, which is the first democratic republic of the modern era, as I touch upon in my book, it really is born as an oligarchic republic from the very beginning. Okay, the Constitution, and there's like a narrative that there's a founding myth of the United States as a democracy from the very beginning, and in a way for the delegates that went to the convention as enlightened lawyers and intellectuals, basically, that created this fantastic constitution. However, the actual history is different in a way. The constitution basically was written by self-appointed plutocrats. Even if half of the delegates were in fact lawyers, okay, and lawyers are not really a good kind of profession in this, at least in this time and today as well. They're part of the problem of the system as well. Back in the day, 75% of the members were moneylenders of some sort. Okay, so this basically they were hooked on credits that they gave to the popular sectors in the nascent republic. And what is not being told is that the Federal Convention of these self-appointed plutocrats was born out of the reaction against Shays' Rebellion, which was a rebellion by war veterans who, after fighting the War of Independence, went back to their agrarian so their farms, basically their agrarian sources of income. And because of the war, they saw that their farms were devastated and they had to go into debt with the coastal elites, the commercial elites, in order to be able to buy the equipment and the seeds and everything that they needed to basically rebuild. And after the people went into debt because of this, there was a couple of years of drought, and they were unable to have enough production to pay back the moneylenders. And therefore, what happens is that at that point, there were debtors' prisons, and citizenship was attached to being a property owner. So these veterans who had fought for the War of Independence were put in prison because of their debts and stripped from their citizenship. So Shays was a general at that point who had, led one of the groups of citizen soldiers, led, or it's not even led because he was part of a group, led this uprising, and they burned the courthouses in which all these records of debt were kept. And if we see Madison's notes and Federalist Papers on the U.S. Republic, it is a strong point is made that the Republican structure need to protect against the people not honoring their debts, that this is something that it needs to be honored, and therefore these rascals basically that are burning the records needed to put in their place and needed to not be able to fight back. So the same as in the Roman Empire, also the veterans had a great impact on the rebellions that pop up once in a while to protest against plutocracy and slavery based on debt. So the United States, before the Vietnam War, they have the military draft, so the mandatory conscription. And as we know, the Vietnam War sparked lots of protests, and the veterans and the other people that didn't want to go into the war started protesting, and that ended up by abolishing the military draft and abolishing this connection between the citizens and war. So this, different from Machiavelli, in which there was a decoupling of oligarchy from war, here there's a decoupling of citizens from war. which allowed for a free range for the oligarchic republic to engage in war at will, okay, through Congress in a way. And of course, Congress is supposedly the representatives of the people. However, they are the elite that we authorize and not really the representatives of the people, because if they were, they would not go into war, right? So during the 20th century, in this post-Vietnam era, we see that there's a lot of illegal interventions. And I called it interventions because, you know, it is really bombings and murder at the global scale. And we have that this decoupling of the citizens and war allowed for these interventions and this kind of testing the waters in which we see how the United States was transgressing international law little by little and creating a state of lawlessness. However, it is after 9/11 that basically the United States engaged in full-blown illegal wars and also interventions, the majority of them in Latin America, but also in the 20th century in Latin America and the Middle East. So we have the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, Lebanon, and other places in the Middle East, which are ongoing military interventions. And only in the post-war, post-9/11 period, we have that at least 4.5 million people have been killed due to the US illegal interventions. So here, I want to talk a little bit about Israel's illegal war, which is funded by the US. So it's in a way, another way of controlling indirectly the war through finance, which is very interesting. So the United States gives annually $3.8 billion in military assistance to Israel, which is an incredible amount of money. And since October 7, it has given more than double that amount. Because 6.5 billion is already outdated. There's more money that had been gone. So basically, it is Israel's war, however, is funded by the United States, but that doesn't give really the US control, or at least we see from the rhetoric that doesn't give control. Okay. However, we have seen that the state of Israel is an enclave from the United States from the very beginning. In a way, it was seen from the United States as a crucial enclave in the Middle East. In addition, Israel has dropped more than 10,000 highly destructive bombs and missiles. And this has allowed for the U.S. arms dealers to make record profits. So here we have the military complex making a profit out of an indirect war in Palestine. So, for example, we have Lockheed Martin, which makes the planes that have dropped the bombs, and with almost a 55% in return, outperforming, you know, the other companies by 18%. And the same as the bunker buster bombs made by RTX, they have had almost 83% return this year, and has performed the equivalent of the companies by 46%. This is an outrageous amount of profit that these arms dealers have acquired. So, and in terms of the destruction of nature, we see that these bombs have released 60 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. So it's not only about making record profits for the arms dealers, but also about the destruction of nature without no regard to climate change or anything. So this 60 million tons is it's equivalent to the annual emissions of 135 countries together. Okay, this is outrageous and is not talked about enough in the media. So now I want to finish by talking a little bit about empire and how the rhetoric of the United States as an oligarchic republic have gone back to the Roman Empire as a source of narrative and a source of inspiration for its extractivism and colonization and the merging of the financial, military, and technical and tech complex with government. So first we see that since the 2000s and since this kind of decoupling of citizens and war, the United States have put bases, military bases in 179 countries. And 82 countries, 82 countries, and there's more than 700 bases around the world, okay? And one of them is in Greenland. So a part of, Trump's rhetoric is that they want to buy Greenland, invade Greenland, and basically Greenland has not only a military base, but also a nuclear weapons storage. From a couple of decades ago, basically, that is operating. So you can see that the majority of countries in the world have a US base, with the great exception, of course, of Russia and China and India, okay? When we think about extractivism and how the empire relates to this, I want to touch upon Donald Trump's inauguration speech, in which basically he completely disregards climate change and argues that the United States needs to drill oil again. And he brought back the slogan that was Sarah Palin's, the running mate of, I forgot the name. The Sarah Palin's, the governor from Alaska, who basically argued that we really need to start drilling in Alaska and the Arctic. John McCain was the running mate, and basically he comes back to with this slogan, "Drill, baby, drill," and he is pushing and opening up places that were shut down by environmentalist organizations for drilling oil once again. And in terms of the extractivism, we see that in terms of Greenland is not only about military bases, but also about the rare minerals that exist there and that the US wants to get their hands on. So lithium and other rare minerals are part of it, and Denmark already has said that they're not going to sell Greenland to the US, but still this is part of the hegemonic source of control over the region, okay? That the US thinks they have and they want to forward. The same happens with the Panama Canal, another kind of a policy that Donald Trump wants to forward, claiming that the Panama Canal was built by the US, paid by the US, and as we remember, it was given back to Canada, to Panama by Jimmy Carter. And one of the caveats of that giving back the Panama Canal to Panama was that only the Panama state can have control over the canal. And now Donald Trump says that China has some kind of a docking port in the canal, and therefore, based on this caveat, they want to invade the Panama Canal, Panama, to take over the Panama Canal and have basically secure the commercial route. Okay, so this is kind of coming back to also kind of the Roman Empire and the commercial routes and the colonization for extraction and the bringing of gold, very mercantilist in a way. On the other hand, we have the settlements that are popping up in the West Bank. That is kind of another source of extractivism and colonial endeavor, and also the latest push for the reconstruction of Gaza or the development of Gaza by the US. Okay, and this is very problematic in many ways. Of course, it's not only that they're going to give money for the Palestinians to reconstruct, but they're going to bring their own people and they're going to basically create their own form of development in the region. And this is coupled with the gas exploitation, that there's gas resources in the coast of Gaza. And Netanyahu, just at the beginning of the war, gave a few leases for the exploitation of this gas. So there's always kind of a geopolitical and also wealth-related push for kind of colonizing new territories. And here I want to touch upon the connection between the Trump administration, and this is also from the first government, but now with more force, spearheaded by Elon Musk, and the connection between the United States and Rome and the Roman Empire. So as a source of imagination, if you will, for the oligarchic empire. So he has been tweeting nonstop, basically, on the relation between the US and Rome, and argues that America is the new Rome, and basically Trump is, it could be the equivalent to the new emperor, and this is kind of something that needs to be embraced. We see that it is not only rhetorical, but also is connected to its own endeavor and Elon Musk's endeavor on the financial tech military complex, and the project of making Mars the next frontier for extraction. So all the SpaceX project of Elon Musk, basically funded by US tax dollars, and the entrenchment of the military complex and the tech complex in the government is now almost complete in a way. So this is something to look for. He basically argues that this launching of the rockets to Mars is part of the new imperial ambitions of the US, and that the wealth oligarchs and the government are today just one, basically. And here we see Elon Musk and Trump holding hands as Roman soldiers, okay? And this is something that is not created as memes by someone else, but actually tweeted by Elon Musk himself. And we saw from the inauguration that the people that were more prominent in the inauguration ceremony were what they're called the tech bros. Okay, so we have Zuckerberg of Meta, we have Bezos from Amazon, and we have Elon Musk from SpaceX and X. And Tesla, right? And also we have in that bunch the owner of TikTok, that is not in the picture, but basically this is a part of the kind of the alliance of tech. If we think about it, they are competitors. They shouldn't be together in a way, but they are together, and they are all completely enmeshed in the government structure by giving services on surveillance to the government, and by forwarding a narrative in their social media, by censoring some forms of speech and enabling others. And here I want to touch upon the new role of Elon Musk in the government, the DOGE, a new institution, which is the Department of Government Efficiency. And this is incredible. It is remarkable in the sense that the DOGE, as we know, was the supreme leader in a way in Venice, oligarchic republic, in which the DOGE was a position for life. And even if it was selected in a manner that by elites, that it would allow for the impartiality of the DOGE or the wisdom of that person. However, Elon Musk have connected this idea of the DOGE as kind of the top official in the republic, and has given it to himself, and he's going to be in charge of cutting and proposing cuts and other government contracts through this office. So because he's got his own business is so enmeshed in the system, he has a conflict of interest that is clear, and this means basically the fusion of the oligarchic wealth and the oligarchic elite and the political power. So it's not an indirect rule anymore, it's really the direct rule of the wealthy. And finally, when with this I end, is the latest iteration of this kind of fusion between tech and government, and the rise of kind of the fascist oligarchy. Elon Musk, during the inauguration of Donald Trump, made 2 Nazi salutes. And he claimed that they were not Nazi salutes, they were Roman salutes. And again, coming back to the idea of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire as a source of imagination for the new imperial project of the US. But then he, of course, back in December, had wrote an op-ed in Germany saying that the AfD was the last spark of hope, and basically he endorsed the far-right party. So here we see that the oligarchic power has really become totalitarian, and the full circle has become true in a way that the oligarchic democracies have become really illiberal oligarchic democracies. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Camila, for this really great talk and the broad and encompassing view of corruption and oligarchic power over the centuries until the very present. Yeah, so we have plenty of time for discussion now, for questions. Please either just raise your hand with the hand symbol, which you find below, or just make a note in the chat if you have a question, and then we'll take the questions and give Camila the chance to answer. Okay, so there's one question in the chat. I'll just read it from Sergio. He cannot turn on the camera and microphone, so I'll read the question. Thanks for the very thought-provoking presentation. In the context of your talk, taking into account inequality and oligarchy, what do you think is popular about populism today, since populist governments often work against the interests of the majority of the population? Greetings from Brazil.
Thank you so much for the question. So in my previous work, and this is kind of was my side project during the dissertation, and has been kind of like a project that runs parallel to my other work. I have traced the idea of populism to plebeian politics and back to the Roman Republic. Because if we think about the Roman Republic, we had the tribunes as exclusive representatives of the people. And the people understood as the plebeians, the common people, not the elite. So not the people as a whole, right? Not the ethnic people, but the class-based people, right? Not based on ethnos, but on class. And these representatives were exclusive, were described by Cicero as some of them as being populares. So there were tribunes that, in addition to being exclusive representatives of the people, were kind of a surplus of representation, a populares. So it's kind of, and he argued basically that these populares were not there to just represent or keep the system in check and kind of like just reproduce the system, but the populares were the representatives that would forward the interests of the common people against the oligarchy. And here, with the two most famous is Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who were murdered in the streets. So their authority was supposedly was sacrosanct, was violated, and what they were promoting was the agrarian reform, was citizenship reform, and all in favor of the lower classes. So from this kind of surplus of representation in the Roman Republic, which is very clear who is the people, I trace the idea of the populares as populist today. And of course, we have the modern version. The modern version of the populist is born in Russia in the 1860s, out of the emancipation of the serfs, and is connected to self-government and to representation in office, and is always based on the class-based component of the people. The same idea of populism, because in Russia were the narodniks, the friends of the people, so it really is the definition is populism. Then it was taken up in the United States in the 1890s by the People's Party or the Populist Party. And this People's Party lasted only a few years, and it basically was born out of an alliance of the emancipated Black Americans, the tenants in lands that were Black, basically, and in many places they could not really be free, and the white tenants. So there was a cross-racial alliance that put the system in peril, if you will, the system of the white supremacy. So they were so successful And there were a lot of women involved as well. So they were very egalitarian. They were the ones who promoted recall elections. So recall elections is one of the features of populist policy, okay? Also the nationalization of transport and other forms of resources of the state, okay? Those were the kind of, if we think about populism as a platform of policies, those were the policies were strictly economic in a way, and strictly, if you think, socialist in character. Actually, Lenin would famously made a name for himself against the populists in Russia, because for him was a form of unscientific socialism, was a kind of a primitive form of socialism, and Marxism was the way to go. So therefore, he attacked the populists, not because they were ethno-nationalists, as is today, right? Or at least we think about it today, but because of their kind of lack of scientific reasoning in terms of economics, okay? So after the American populists, we have a long tradition of populists in Latin America, in which, again, there were presidents, and here the regime type is very important. It's not parliamentary. It's very difficult to be populist when you have a parliamentary system, even if we have Podemos today and we had Syriza for a while. This kind of the regime type allows for the president to become the leader of a faction, of the common people's faction. And we have one of the most famous populists was, of course, Juan Perón in Argentina, right? And Juan Perón actually included in the constitution the Workers' Bill of Rights, the first one. So we have really a populist president that is forwarding a Workers' Bill of Rights, giving the workers vacations, recreational facilities, social security, all these things that we connect with kind of socialist politics, right? So this was the strand. And in Latin America, it basically stayed the same. And we can think about some of the so-called populists that campaign on a populist platform, but then when in government, completely switched. For example, in Peru, Alberto Fujimori, who was a populist in the campaign trail, but when he came to office, he immediately became neoliberal and cut all the services. So we cannot really think about him as a populist because he didn't really make material his platform. And from this kind of perspective of the 20th century, I criticize the new European-based definition of populism, which is basically put forward by this comparative politics scholar, Casmude, who is a scholar of the far right. Okay, so someone that dedicated their life to understanding the far right. So because, and I think the problem with naming the far right fascist in Europe, at least at the beginning of the 2000s, is that fascism was a dirty word and even could not be used. I think in Germany, it's kind of, you cannot really tell that someone is a fascist without going into legal problems, right? So in a way, that word was changed by the populist concept. So Moore, basically, based on his studies of the far right, he creates this encompassing concept of populism in which he abstracts the few and the many, because we have, if we think about populism as the politics of the many, then he abstracts these categories and thinks about any kind of dichotomy as working through populism. So if you have the many are ethno-nationalists, then that is also populism, even if the policies of those parties or leaders have nothing to do with the historic populism. And this is born in Europe and then picked up in the United States. So it's very kind of global north kind of understanding, and has been, as I would argue, a kind of a conceptual colonialism. Because if we have a whole 20th century of populism in Latin America that is based on class-based politics, now we need to kind of rethink that category based on what is coming from the global north and relabel our leaders, right? So that is so absurd that people call Bolsonaro in Brazil a populist, while he is an admirer of Pinochet, the fascist leader in Chile, and basically has no policy that is in favor of the common people. The basic platform of the so-called neo-populist, the far-right populist, is the anti-immigration policy. So that is mainly ethno-nationalist policy based on the people as ethnos and not the people as class. So I've been trying to kind of push back that definition in a way, and arguing that populism is a form of plebeian politics. And because today plebeians are not a legal category, so before in the Roman Republic, actually you were part of this category, not just based on class, but because of a legal understanding. Today we don't have that. So it's very difficult for plebeians or the plebeian group to actually coalesce and have a movement in a way. It's very ephemeral in a way. And it's very different from ethno-nationalist politics, which are based on strong markers of identity, which do not go away. Class-based markers of identity are very fluid in a way and very ephemeral. The moment that you start making more money, you stop caring about that, right? But ethno-nationalism is based on something that is permanent in a way. It is your ethnic group, and it's very easy to weaponize. So for me, this labeling of fascism, of neo-fascism, as populism has basically normalized fascist politics, because populism is not really threatening as a concept. It's not good in a way. People say, you know, economically speaking, they have made mistakes and they overspend and all these other things. However, they haven't killed anyone. Right? So the idea that deportations are not part of the populist, so the proper populist policy, the violation of human rights is not the case. However, they go against separation of powers, because separation of powers today works for the oligarchy. You have Congress and the judicial system really working to protect oligarchic interests instead of protecting the people. So sometimes the populist leaders, such as Hugo Chavez, have been pushing, were pushing for against the separation of powers, and famously introduced recall elections in the constitution, and he was subject to a recall election in his own tenure. Okay, so I think we need to rethink populism from a policy-based perspective instead of a kind of abstract the few and the many situation that was developed. This concept was developed from a far-right perspective.
Great, thank you. Yeah, if there are questions, please just raise your hands. I have one thing maybe regarding the concept of capitalism, or how you think about also the transformations of capitalism from this diagnosis that you make. I mean, so basically, I think there are kind of two maybe conflicting perspectives one can see here. I mean, one perspective would suggest that there is something like sometimes it has been called like a refeudalization of capitalism. So there is, you know, a kind of from the era of bourgeois or liberal capitalism, where there was at least this kind of facade of meritocracy and you know, a kind of rule-based competition. We are now in a kind of era in which you know, you have these individuals basically, and what Adorno and Horkheimer called rackets, kind of gangs who come together to make profit, who forge these political alliances, and who kind of use, you know, the deinstitutionalization basically of the order to just pursue their own, often violently, their own interests. And at the same time, another perspective would suggest that, well, there's still, you know, it's not really the rule of individuals, but it's still a kind of form of structural domination in which individual players might be able to use certain openings, but you know, there's broader processes in the background that have to do with the inner logic of capitalism that are ultimately decisive, and that the analysis should focus on. So I was just wondering what your perspective on this is. I mean, is you know, is it? I mean, you know, obviously at the moment, also because of the redistribution of political power, actors like Musk, you know, who's also the richest man on earth, so that is a factor that matters, I guess, are at the center of attention. But you know, how do we relate this attention to individual actors and what they are doing to the more structural dynamics of capitalism and the kind of underlying logic? Is there a way to reconcile these perspectives in your way, in your perspective? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. So, first of all, oligarchy and the idea of oligarchy, of course, precedes capitalism, right? And Marx famously, he went into the study of oligarchy and the dynamics from the Roman Republic to today, to his own day. So I think there are two different things that are going on, because capitalism is a form of economic system, right? It's an economic system in which the narrative goes that everybody could take advantage of this and everybody could, be an entrepreneur, right? However, it has functioned as a way to further empower the oligarchy, and is seen as something that is kind of fair in a way, at least in the narrative, that because everybody can make it in a way, and the people that are wealthy are just legitimately wealthy because they have done good investments, and they have worked hard, or whatever the narrative is, right? And therefore allows for the oligarchy to rise beyond what was acceptable before. Okay, and if we think about capitalism and oligarchy in the 70s, we see that the rule of law and the ethical codes that existed back then, so before the decoupling of military and citizen and all that happened in the 70s, that kind of rule of law and ethical codes were really constraining the oligarchy in their decisions. Okay, so if we think about the ratio of the salary of CEOs vis-a-vis the workers in the company in the 70s was 7-1 or 10-1. Today, the average is 300-1, and we even go to 2,000-1. So workers would have to live several lives to just make the CEO's annual salary. Okay, so in the 70s, there was no rule against paying your CEOs whatever they wanted in a way, or whatever you want to pay them, or bonuses or whatever. However, when there's this decoupling, and basically we have this kind of savage capitalism growing, then we also have the erosion of the ethical component that was undergirding the system. Okay, so I think that is something to take into account. And also the different phases of capitalism. I follow really closely Albena Zmanova's precarity capitalism as a way of understanding how capitalism and neoliberalism works today. Because basically we have, and as you say, there's a kind of neo-feudal understanding of capitalism in which it's a very, in a pyramid structure in which the workforce is just paid not even a wage to live, right? And we're back to the moments of the Industrial Revolution in a way. So it's not neo-feudal, but it's at the birth of capitalism as a system. And it is the oligarchy really taking advantage of the system and allowing for this to happen based on the narrative of the bottom line and the need to actually do this in order to survive in this savage system, okay? So I think when we need to analyze and we're thinking about capitalism, we need to decouple it from oligarchy. There are two things going on in a way. So we can actually have oligarchy without capitalism. We can have oligarchy and a mercantilist, a form of system, and we're actually moving there in a way. Because if we have the economic or the oligarchy taking control of government and regulation, then there's not going to be any more free market in a way. There's going to be just a structural market that is going to favor the oligarchs that are on top at that certain point, right? So if we think about capitalism as the ideology of free markets, then it's not really free at all, in the sense that now, before it was the illusion of being free, because it was always based on lobbyism. For example, another thing that I forgot to say is that we have basically legalized corruption in our modern world. So at the beginning of the 20th century, campaign finance and lobbyism were illegal. Of course, giving money to representatives, was always illegal. However, in the 80s and in the 90s with Bill Clinton and others, the lobbyists were so strong and were so pervasive that they had to legalize lobbyism and create a list of lobbyists. So the same is happening now when new rules that are clearly unfair and against the free markets are being entrenched, right? So this is kind of a part of the relation between capitalism and oligarchy. So in a way, oligarchy can actually destroy capitalism and just become kind of a new form of state-run system in which the oligarchs are in charge, right? Because we have Donald Trump, also a billionaire in a way, and Musk, now the richest man on earth, plus Bezos and the other 3 richest people on earth are in charge, basically, or, you know, they had a lot of influence in the government. So the probability that they will rig the game further in order to undermine the competition that undergirds the system is very high. So analytically, I think we need to make that distinction, because we tend to conflate it. And oligarchy is older than capitalism.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, other questions? Rodrigo.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. I found the presentation amazing. I have 3 questions I would like to ask. The first 2 are a bit more conceptual, I would think. I was really interested by the way you tied the idea of systemic corruption, or the concept of systemic corruption you propose, with this kind of instrumentalization of the rule of law to benefit the oligarchs. I was wondering how fundamental or radical the critique of the rule of law is in this claim. I mean, is the claim that the rule of law can have, like, more or less, as you kind of mentioned, this constraining role, and then in some historical contexts or in systemic corruption precisely that is lost, or is there like something more deeply problematic with the rule of law itself? I was particularly thinking of the work, for example, of Marcelo Neves on Brazil and the so-called peripheral modernity, because Neves makes the argument that in regimes or societies where you don't have a really functional differentiation between law and other spheres like politics or economics, then political or economical power or economic power can just translate into legislation, and that is precisely problematic. And in such a society where law is not differentiated as an autonomous system, then you don't have anything like the rule of law at all. So I was kind of wondering in this direction as a first conceptual question. Then I had a second one, which is kind of related with regards to the separation of powers, as you criticized it with Condorcet and the case of the U.S. Because at least in the legal, in the German debate, you have like this differentiation between the idea of separation of power as a strict separation and something more like a division or articulation of different powers. And for example, someone like Hans Kelsen makes the point that the idea of the separation of powers as a strict separation is problematic, because if the executive is categorically separated from the legislative and from the judicial, then it's not really bound to it, and you can fall easily in this kind of authoritarian forms of power and control domination. And the case example he uses is precisely the US. He says something like, yeah, the US wants to emancipate itself from Britain, but actually the way the presidential system in the constitution empowers the president is basically the same way in which the king in Britain had the same power, veto powers, and so forth and so on. So in this case, I would also ask the question, what kind of concept of the separation of powers is being criticized, and is there like something, you know, utterly or radically problematic with itself, or it's more like a distortion in kind of a capitalistic historical context? And just like a small third question, if it's not too much, it would be like when you talked about the decoupling between citizenship and war and the idea of a standing army as a professional institution, I was thinking of precisely the history of Latin America. I read this book not so long ago from Hilda Sabato about republics of the New World, and there she makes the strong point of saying, like, against this more or less you know, a stereotypical idea of political power and republics in Latin America are always chaotic and sunk into war and conflict. She said that militias had a really important role as a kind of citizens' army, not only on the one hand as a kind of defense mechanism of society against imperial or neo-colonial attacks, but also of holding rulers and government accountable and having like this, you know, not only symbolic but also material power and material force to kind of stop abuses, for example, from oligarchic elites. So I was wondering, do you have like a take on this, on the idea of the potentials, or even like, you know, sounds weird, but like the democratic potentials of militias in a kind of democratic societies? That would be interest me a lot. In any case, thanks.
Thank you for these questions. They're great. I'm going to answer the first 2 kind of connected. Yeah, my critique of the separation of powers is, and the rule of law is really foundational in a way, is what is wrong with liberalism. And if you think about liberalism, and this I also wrote a paper on it, basically liberalism is born out of like John Locke's, understanding of, rights as property. So his republic was one of property owners, right? So whoever was not an owner was not really part of the people, right? So in a way of the people, instead of the people being the commoners, the people became the property owners. And this is what happens in England, right? The House of Commons is born in the 14th century. At the same time, the enclosure movement, so the oligarchs enclosing common land, started. So in a way, there's a kind of cooptation of that concept, which is very interesting. But going back to liberalism and the rule of law, for Locke, the only reason for you to rebel is and the only legitimate reason for rebelling is that the right to property is violated, okay? So this is the problem with the rule of law in general, in which if the rule of law is made by the rich or by property owners, of course it will serve them, right? It's not that they are altruistic and it will serve the people. So for me, it's who makes the law, which is important. So in the Roman Republic, it was the plebs who made the law. And they passed agrarian reforms, and famously at the time of more corruption, they passed a series of sumptuary laws, so laws against luxury. Okay, so these are the laws that were passed by the plebs, and they serve the plebs. So if you're going to have the rule of law, it needs to be made by the people themselves and not by the representatives, who are not really representatives, are just the few empowered by the votes of the many, and the parties are basically co-opting the process. So the problem with the rule of law in general is that we, as in the post-liberal system, we have equated the rule of law with liberty. And in the ancient republic, and also with Machiavelli, liberty is not really related to law. It's related in the sense that law allows for liberty to exist, okay? But the rule of law is not liberty, because the law can also be used to oppress you. So the law is a tool instead of, sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah. Sorry about that. So who makes the law is important in a way. And the issue is that basically the people have no role in making the law. Okay, and basically the rule of law has been instrumentalized in order to sell the idea that the rule of law is liberty, liberty for the common people. And of course, the judiciary is this institution that supposedly embodied the position of the tribunes in the ancient republic. Actually, we call tribunals, right? The idea of the tribunals is because they are there to protect us from the oligarchs, and the law will protect us from that, from the few. Okay. However, we now see that the judicial system is there to, as Montesquieu would say, a null power, is there to simply interpret the law. So if the law is oligarchic and was made in an oligarchic way, then the judiciary has nothing else to do than to apply that law, right? And this is how the problem with the judiciary as kind of the protector of liberty has come about. Then, in terms of the separation of powers, the problem with separation of powers is that not really is a separation of powers; it's a separation of functions. Because power needs to be rooted in actual real power. And in the Roman Republic, each institution was rooted in a specific sector of society. So it was kind of an institutional manifestation of the power on the ground. Okay. Today we have just separation of functions. So this operation happened with Montesquieu and a little bit before, and basically is a kind of a abstraction of the power on the real world to a separation in the legal realm. Okay. So, and one of the problems that you bring to the fore is that sometimes the executive power is not bound by law. And I think here in Germany is very interesting what has happened with the public policy on anti-Semitism. So even if the courts have ruled against the discrimination against BDS, for example, in Munich a couple of years ago, and therefore has deemed this attack or this discrimination against this political movement as unconstitutional, the government has still gone forward in terms of developing the idea of anti-Semitism as the hostility towards Israel, okay? Something that is clearly unconstitutional, okay? And is on the books. And therefore, the public policy is going to have an effect on universities and scholars because it's attached to funding. So again, we see that like in the ancient republic, the Senate, in a way, that is the connection with finance, is the one that has actually the control over policy and over real politics in a way. So you can actually think about the German government running with this idea of anti-Semitism, defunding all of the scholars and all the institutions that are not abiding by the new rule, a rule that is clearly unconstitutional, and that the court has nothing to say until someone brings a claim, right? So there is also the idea of time and how there's a delay, right? And sometimes that redress will never happen, okay? So there is a detachment. On the one hand, you have the judiciary only applying the law and not being activists, like, for example, in the case of India and others, that is like the activist courts. The majority of the courts are not activists, so they just can only abide by the letter, right? And this is problematic if the law is oligarchic. And on the other, that the executive can create its own law in a way that is not law, it's policy, and have an effect on society without the courts being able to protect you, okay? Because it is a reaction towards that overgrowth of power, okay? And in terms of the decoupling in Latin America of the military and the citizens, I think the militias, and this is in the Republican theory and practice, militias were there to empower the common citizens. So the common citizens, Machiavelli would say, you need to arm them with weapons and law. You need to have both in a way. You need to be able to pass legislation and kind of make an intervention in the system, and in addition have weapons. So when push comes to shove, you can actually defend yourself. If you disarm the public, then you are at the mercy of oligarchy. And in addition, what has happened is that not only you disarm the militias and therefore undermine the power of the commons, but also create the standing army, which co-opts the commons. So today in Latin America and many places around the world, the people that serve in the military are the poorest sectors of the population because they are there for getting an education and they have benefits. So therefore, the lower classes are co-opted into the military and become the mercenaries of the oligarchic state. So this operation, and in a way of kind of efficiency and in the name of efficiency and modernity, it was actually against the power of the common people.
Great, thank you. Yeah, other questions, more remarks? There's a question in the chat, where do we go from here? If this is how we got into this mess, of course, that is the big question, I guess. If you have any thoughts on that, you might start with that, and then we can go to Doha next.
Yes, so at the end of my book, I actually, in the epilogue, I put this, what is to be done, right? With this mess, in a way, how do we get out? So we need to think about how the system works. So we need to hijack the system in a way. And there are two ways to do it. One is to elect a leader, a real populist leader, that would be able to dismantle oligarchy and really kind of be like a tribune in a way and offer their lives. This is a very dangerous job in a way to go against the oligarchs. We have the example of Salvador Allende in Chile, who was basically murdered, you know, we don't know, committed suicide, murder, whatever, during the coup, and because he nationalized copper and he went against the copper businesses of the United States, and therefore there was a CIA-backed coup that finished, you know, the experiment, and this has been replicated elsewhere. So in a way, we can do that. We can in presidential systems, not in parliamentary systems, because parliamentary systems tend to kind of tame the popular will, because you need so many votes and so many representatives to have a majority that is very, very difficult to actually get there. However, if you have one leader that is able to do that, you can actually hijack the system. However, that leader needs to campaign in a very specific platform, which is to devolve power to the people. And how do we do that is to, again, establish an infrastructure, a political infrastructure for the people as it existed in the Roman Republic. Because we cannot think that just electing someone different will change the system. This is just absurd to me, in a way. It's really about the system. The system works by itself, right? So you really need to create something new in order to change the power dynamics. So I have argued that, and here I base my project in Condorcet's Constitution of 1793, which is the Constitution of Revolutionary France, in which he seeks to institutionalize a network of primary assemblies, at the neighborhood level. And he gave to these assemblies the power to veto, to initiate, and even to initiate a constituent process. Okay, so basically, the people themselves would instead of being just consumers of politics, would become agents of politics, and that is something that we need to get used to, right? So you can do that top down, like a project, and I think that is the most difficult one, because in that kind of in between the election and the egos and the problems that you can encounter, that could fail. Okay, the other way is to do experiments, to do several experiments, several ground zeros around the world, in which at the local level you can have a form of popular republic, in which the mayor of a city, for example, or the district council which has power in a district, could devolve power to the people and allow for these primary assemblies to emerge and have real power to not only propose but also contest the rule. And this is the difficult thing, because because our system is representative, we are bound to the leaders that we elect. And those leaders, in order to be pro-people, they need to give that power that they have back to the people. And this is something that is very difficult to do, because nobody wants to devolve power. They want to do it themselves. They want to impose a project. And part of being a Democrat and believing in the popular republic is that you need to believe in the people, that the people need to learn how to make decisions, need to learn how to be actors of politics, and is the only way to be more intelligent citizens and counteract oligarchy from the ground up. So it needs to be kind of a multi-level project that actually could be global. For example, I work with water defendants in Mexico and elsewhere, in which there were movements and kind of popular democracy at the ground level, and they were able to fight against the corporations that were stealing the water. However, the moment that they had a victory, the company just moved to another place. And therefore, there was no sharing of information, no sharing of resistance, no solidarity. And therefore, there's a need for creating a network that is global, specifically when it comes to environmental and climate change policy, right? So the national level, I think it is a no-go, because it's too difficult. And they could, if they just, kill one leader, then all gone, basically. And I think we need to be able to do a more kind of what Deleuze says, a rhizomatic form of politics, in which there are organizations on the ground that can actually communicate and be able to interface with power. Of course, it's not easy, but this is the way to go, I would say. And these organizations do not need to be specific, assemblies with a specific structure, but actually could be an ecosystem of the organizations that already exist on the ground. The people is organized, in a way, in many places, from unions to movements to cooperatives to community-based organizations. This organization exists. We cannot see it because nobody cares about it, but we need to make it visible and connect them, because the power is always in numbers.
Thank you. Doa, you're next.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had a conceptual question too. Firstly, I apologize for, I think that was an interruption by my part. But I also had some questions about the relationship between oligarchy and capitalism. And I was thinking throughout your talk about how do we know if someone is elite or an oligarch. And I think there seem to be a couple of ways that you described it throughout the talk. One of them was based on some kind of numerical wealth. So for example, the distinction between the 10% and 1%. And I think in other parts, there was a description or reference to the Congress, for example, the people who are in a position of power. Now, I think when we think about both of them, there are some questions and problems that arise. If we go through the numerical description, then we have the question of where to draw the line. Is it going to be the 10% or 1% or 0.1%, for example? And even if we find for example, a line, then there's also the further question of how do these people get their wealth? And presumably the way that they get the wealth, the amount of that the wealth they have, is going to be analytically prior to the numerical accumulation and measure. And I think that will also determine the differences between different class societies and different types of oligarchies. And when we think about people in position of power, of course, in terms of their numerical wealth, they have immense differences between for example, even CEOs with an average worker. But when we compare them with the monopolists, like you mentioned, for example, Elon Musk, I think the question is, do the people represented in Congress, do they serve the interests of the monopolies, or do monopolies serve the interest of people who are selected in Congress, for example, and have more a term that is 4 years? And I think in many of the cases, the first one was the prior explanation in your case. So I think they wouldn't be called oligarchs in the same manner, and there will be a priority to the head of monopolists. And then again, we come back to the first question: how do they become monopolists in the first place? What allows them to accumulate the wealth? And I think and I think perhaps that is impossible to answer without talking about the ownership structure of productive apparatuses. And I think everyone sees where I'm going with this is a more Marxist basis to talk about oligarchy. And perhaps maybe that's more preferable or not. And does it get us to the core of the problem in a more specific manner? It tells us about how not only talking about the numerical distinction, which is where do we form the arbitrary line, but also shows us how the specific mode of accumulation and the solution that needs to remedy this, and shows that it's because of their control and ownership of these productive apparatuses that they get that wealth in the first place. And I think that also brings back to your point on oligarchy existed before capitalism, but so did class societies. But at the same time, I guess we can ask, can capitalism exist without oligarchy? And your example was the 70s, but I think one can still say that was a certain form of oligarchy, even in the heyday of social democracy, especially in the way that you described, for example, laws and the legal system preferring and making a few more and more rich and like directing the society towards their advancement. And I think there's a case to be made that even wage labor itself is a way of doing that. As long as wage labor exists, wage labor is a way of is that legal system which is not even like voted for or accepted as completely normal foundation of capitalist societies. So as long as wage labor exists, some kind of oligarchy will exist, even though whatever social democracy we will have, and a certain structural domination will exist, because wage labor means, in precisely the way that you described, in the accumulation or in the production of wealth, always brings the majority of that wealth to a certain elite. And perhaps precisely because we didn't solve that problem, that social democracy could arrive at where we are today. So that again brings the question of, can there be capitalism without oligarchy? And instead of talking about oligarchy, would it be more advantageous to talk about this class relation in terms of capitalist versus workers, more class-based, this traditional Marxist approach that highlights specifically ownership and control over the productive apparatuses? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Can capitalism exist without oligarchy? I would say no, or at least capitalism enables oligarchy because it is a system based on profit, right? And the accumulation of profit. So it's very difficult to have a system in which everything is based on profit and not allow it to accumulate, because what is the point then, right? So either we would have more a cooperative kind of understanding, right? So of the system. So in a way, I don't think you can have capitalism without oligarchy. In terms of what oligarchy is, so oligos is the power of the few, okay? And of course, as Aristotle says, the idea that the foundational idea of oligarchy is that the few have power. It happens to be that the few are always rich. However, that is not the base of oligarchy. So is the power of the few or the powerful few? You can think about oligarchy as a tendency in any organization. And you have here Robert Michels in the beginning of the 20th century, the iron law of oligarchy, in which every organization that has a leadership tends to oligarchy. So even in unions, even in parties that are labor parties, you have this detachment between the leadership and the rank and file. And that is defined also as a form of oligarchy if it is entrenched in a way, right? So we need to think about oligarchy as pervasive, as encompassing and pervasive and never being able to be eliminated. So even if we think about communism or whatever it is that the new society, you will always have to have anti-oligarchic methods in order to dismantle the tendency to accumulate power in the few, either because they have more wisdom, or they have more money or more expertise. Whatever it is that distinguishes you from the rank and file will allow you to accumulate power. So you need to have mechanisms of that. So I actually was in a conference in Chicago a few days ago on sortition. So sortition and rotation in power, they're two mechanisms of dismantling oligarchic tendencies in any organization, okay? So for me, and I differ from other Republican theorists like John McCormack, in which oligarchy is only based on wealth, and we need to separate the wealthy from the commons, okay? Of course, would be desirable in the sense that it is, it would be kind of reifying of the identities, easier to have like a class consciousness, all these things that happen. However, it would be anti-liberal, and it would not be able to, it would be unconstitutional everywhere. You cannot really give more political power or more political rights to a part of the population based on their wealth. This would be to go back to the 20th century, in which basically there were wealth requirements for citizenship, right? For active citizenship. So I think we are past that. We cannot go back to that and kind of separate the 1% or the 10%. For me, it is more based on the position that you occupy in society. That should be the defining feature of oligarchy. So if you are in a position of power, whatever that power is, you are in oligarchy. You have power and you are few. This is the definition, right? So this is a kind of more formal understanding of oligarchy that is not really related to wealth. It happens to be that the majority of oligarchs are wealthy. So imagine the United States, in which Congress, every person in Congress makes $200,000 a year at least, plus bonuses. So they're already part of the wealthy, a part of the richest 10%. We think about judges, also part of the richest 10% everywhere in the world, because of their salary and their position and their studies, right? So they separate themselves from the commons, and they are a form of oligarchy because they exercise power in their capacity of being few and being in these positions. So we can think about also religious elites as also being a form of oligarchy. If you have a power over someone, or you have the power to change the system, or to tweak the rules, that makes you part of the oligarchy in a way. You cannot be part of the people. You could be a representative of the people, and you have, the tribunes in Rome, there were patricians. So Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were not plebeian. They were patricians. They were nobles in a way, and they were class traders. This is what the majority of leaders of the people are, class traders. And therefore, due to their wealth, they would qualify as oligarchy. But because of their actions, they are pro-people, right? So I think we need to think about in this regard, the idea of oligarchy. So it's not only the power of wealth, but the power of the position you occupy. And for me, if you're going to have a network of, neighborhood assemblies, all kinds of citizenship or active citizenship is bound by something, right? So for me, there's always exclusions. You exclude the children, you exclude, felons, you exclude other people. So for me, you need to exclude the people in power. So a person that serves as a congresswoman or congressman cannot really be part of the people. This would be absurd because they have power and you do not. If you're a regular citizen, even if you're a CEO in a way, you have the power of your own company. You have no power beyond that in a way, right? So I think one of the issues here is that the oligarchs are always few, so it's easier to kind of insulate in a way. So you don't need to create a rule to exclude them based on their wealth, but you have other forms of exclusion that are based on their actual power that they wield. So now, for example, Musk, who is going to be in a position of power in the Doge, you immediately could exclude him and say this is an oligarch, and needs to be, he's not part of the people, even if before he was not, because he's also a billionaire, right? And in terms of the ownership structure and the wage labor, so if wage labor is based on the profit making and the wage is connected to profit, and the profit is accumulated by the owner of the company in a hierarchical manner, wage labor serves to reproduce the system and to reify the position of the workers vis-a-vis the managers. However, you think about in cooperatives, there's still wage labor, but the salary is determined by a collective decision making and not based on price or on profit or other considerations in a way. So it's a collective decision, how much are you going to be paid, and not really based on your skills, but more based on your needs in a way. So it's not that their salary exists or that remuneration based on this idea of capital wage labor exists, but actually that is dependent on profit and on the accumulation of the profit at the top, right? This is, I think, the problem. And what I said about the 70s is not like, they didn't, capitalism was okay in the 70s, is that at least it was constrained by an ethical code that was not written anywhere. But now it is completely savage in a way. The decoupling has allowed for, whatever it goes in a way. So the limits, the formal limits that existed in the system and the ethical limits have been transgressed in a way. And before, at least capitalism would allow for accumulation of wealth at the top, but also the distribution of wealth in the idea of the welfare state. So you have the gap of inequality was much shorter, was more narrow, if you will. Today it's just exponential, right? So I think that is the issue there is not that, capitalism before worked. It has always been about the accumulation of properties, how much you are allowed to accumulate. And one of the Republican theory policies that we're pushing is for a wealth cap, a wealth tax. So Republicans have always thought about even the elitist Republicans, because for Montesquieu and Madison and others, you need to have, the inequality is always pernicious in a way, always. Because it allows for power to be accumulated and that power to be used to subvert the system, if the system is fairly good. So in a way, you need to be able to allow for a floor, an economic floor, and an economic ceiling for inequality not to run rampant in order to capitalism to work in a way for the people and not only for the oligarchs. It always works for the oligarchs. It always allows for the accumulation of property. How much property you can accumulate and how much wealth you can accumulate, this is another story, right? So if you think about rights and how rights work, all rights, as Hannah Arendt would say, all rights are limited. All freedoms are limited because they are political freedoms, and therefore they always have limits vis-a-vis other rights. However, the only right that can be used and can be exercised without limits is the accumulation of wealth. There's no cap to the accumulation of wealth, and we need to bring it back. Who's going to bring it back? How we're going to bring it back? This is a different story. There are experiments with citizen assemblies, for example, as a kind of intervention to force the hand of government in order to pass this legislation. And this is a way, an exit of the system, I would say, or not an exit, but at least an amelioration of that inequality, right? So Republican theory and also populism are not there to subvert the system, to change the system, to eliminate capitalism. As Lenin said, it was a petit bourgeois ideology. They want everybody to have property in a way, everybody to be an entrepreneur in a way, or everybody to have minimal property to be able to sustain themselves. They don't want to abolish property. That is Marxism and communism. So two different strands, if you will, right? So I think we need to think it separately and understand that this kind of Republican theory is, in a way, systemic, in the sense that you try to, for me, it's a transitional phase. Because from here to a system in which there's no private property of the means of production, we need to really kind of first socialize the machines and all these other things that we can do in the meantime. However, we need a way to do that, and a way to do that is legitimate, in which the elites are not going to kill the tribunes, in a way. We need to be able to understand that there is really an existential threat for the oligarchs, and they will do anything in their power. And now that they are in government, they have the power of the army. So imagine Trump is going to send the military to the border, right? So the use of the military to quell civil disobedience and civil unrest, this is something that was used at the beginning of the 20th century. Then it was not used because it was seen as unconstitutional and an affront to the people. And now it's being brought back in the face of efficiency, right? And the needs of necessity, of existential necessity. So yeah. So in terms of yeah, so I would say I will end that because we're already past time. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, are there any other questions? We don't have to push it too much further because I know that Camila has been struggling with a bit of a cold as well, and so we don't want to overburden you with questions and comments, but if there's any urgent issues that you still want to address, we'll have time for another question or two, I think. Does anyone want to jump in? I mean, so one question that I had, maybe if you still want to speak about that a bit, is you brought in the transnational, the global perspective. I mean, how does the development of a kind of global oligarchy that is not necessarily tied to a particular country and the formation of oligarchies within countries relate? I mean, it seems to be a relatively new phenomenon that someone like Musk, who's not, not even, I mean, he's from South Africa, and he enters the US political system in a way that wouldn't have been really thinkable, I think, not so long ago. So I was just wondering, are there predecessors for that in the history of oligarchy? Or has it been more like a nationally constrained system until now? And do we now see this emergence of not just a transnational oligarchy, but really of an oligarchy that can, jump from one system to another and kind of wield political power across systems almost?
Well, I think that oligarchy and empire has always been connected, right? So it is old as the Roman Empire, in which, the oligarchy would, have their little feuds in the colonies, and they would basically act in concert, even if they were from different ethnic backgrounds. The same happened in Europe with the aristocracy and their connection. So the elite has always been connected, has always been in a network, if you will. Is the people who are not connected in a network, the people who are space-based in a way. The people cannot really reach out to outside of their sphere of action until today, in a way, with social media and other forms of, and the internet. This is something that allows for the people to connect. And of course, it has been weaponized by the elite to pacify the people, right? Not to connect them, or connect them in a manner that is reproducing the system in terms of contesting it. So today, I think the global elite have gone, is a step further in terms of the network, right? That you have exerting power transnationally, but also in the at the political level. So one example of this is the European Union, in which you have all the European Parliament and the different political parties and coalitions that actually receive money from the European Union if they are a coalition. So we have today the case in which the far right and all the far right parties have been receiving money from the European Union to foster their alliance, because basically it's in the books that if you are an alliance, transnational is something good because it, you know, brings polarization down and, you know, consensus and all these things. So now we are actually funding the rise of the far right in a way. So how our processes and rules have been actually fostering this kind of connection among oligarchs around the world, okay? And of course, now with empire, even this is deepened. Okay, so I think when we think about a global oligarchy, the flip side is the global people. So how do we make that happen? Back in the day, in the French Revolution, even if you had this network of primary assemblies, it was very difficult to actually get the word out. You needed a horse with letters. It takes time. Today could be immediate. One of the things that we were working in Chile is to build a platform for the people, the people's platform, in which all these organizations that already exist can register in a way and have communication, can share ideas, can act together in a way, and be able to become a force of their own. And if you think about the coalitions that are transborder, in many places in Latin America and in East Asia and in other places in which they're indigenous peoples do not know borders in a way. They are just populating the area in a way, and they are constantly engaging in alliances across borders. So we need to kind of think about that when we think about how to connect the people at the global level, I would say. And again, the idea of the kind of rhizomatic politics and the network, the people as network. This is what I argue in the book, that we need to think about the people not as a class, not as a group, but as a network of common citizens assembled at the local level and connected in the global level.
Thank you. Okay, and then a last question from Pavel in the chat. So he was wondering whether you see a historical or political economic force that could bring to power the politics of populism, in the sense in which you use the term populism, as Marx has it. For example, the development of productive forces requires a change of production relations. So is there any kind of material basis, I guess, for the kind of politics of populism or the plebeian politics that you would envisage here?
Yeah, I don't think populism as a form of plebeian politics is radical in the sense that aims at changing the system. So if you think about a populist in the United States, Bernie Sanders was the the example of populism, connected to the People's Party before and in his policies. So nationalizing transport, doing recall elections, putting a wealth tax. All these things are there to ameliorate the bad impacts of the system, but not to really change the system. Even if Bernie Sanders defined himself not as a capitalist, if he would have gotten to the presidency, it would be very difficult for him to actually dismantle the private ownership of the means of production, right? So in a way, we need to start by at least putting a cap and put it limits to oligarchy. And this is what, for Machiavelli, is good law. The law that limits the ambition of the wealthy and the powerful. And other law is not good. It's just reproducing a system of domination in a way. So populism would allow for this transition period. I would say that we need that. We need to not go too far and in a leap that we need to really fill in the blank and think about the transition. And at least I define myself as this kind of transition thinker in a way that is, of course, I get attacked by the Marxist, and you're in favor of private property. It's not the case in a way. It is about where we are now, from here to there, right? From here to there, there's a long trek. And we need to think about in this manner that a populist leader and a populist regime that is connected to the people. So in a way, if a populist is going to come and do some tweaking and is not going to empower really the people, then it's not really going to last, because the next president will undermine and will abolish whatever the president did. However, if you give power to the people, it's very difficult to take it away. So I think that is the crux of the argument here, that you need to empower the people, and that is what defines you as a good populist in a way, and the way forward as a transition to another system in which we don't have this accumulation of wealth and can abolish the private means of production. And of course, much has been said about, everything is run by machines, and a few people are the owners of all the means of production in the world, in a way, and the mines and everything. So it's getting easier and easier to just expropriate those people and basically make everybody a property owner, if you will, or partaking in that, easier than before. That is atomized. So the more concentrated the wealth, the more concentrated the means of production, the easier it is to actually abolish that system, if you will. It's more difficult because they have more power. But the moment that you kind of decapitate that elite, it's easier to spread it out, right? The danger is that you can decapitate that elite and basically retain, and a new oligarchy is formed. What happened in the Soviet Union, right? And in China in many ways, in a way, right? You have like the party people are the new oligarchs in a way, and those are the ones, maybe not in Russia are the wealthy, but in the others are people with power in the system in a way, and they are the managers of distribution.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss with us and for joining us today, presenting your lecture. I'm really glad we managed to do this. Thanks everyone for participating in the discussion in this online format. I hope we can have you back in Berlin in person at some point, Camila. So let's be in touch.
Yes.
And hopefully, yeah, welcome you back soon.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to deliver this lecture after all the censorship. So thank you so much.
Of course. Well, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what they were afraid of, but you know, that's where we are. That's yeah.
Yeah, and I will upload the video to the Theoria website, the YouTube. So it will be. I will share it, and also I will share the slides. Okay.
Great. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Okay, take care, everyone. See you soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.